Clementine let out a long sigh, propping herself up to the counter and sliding herself forward on her belly, attempting to squeeze through the small crevice to get to the locked office. The sparkling water inside the small room taunted her, just sitting there waiting for her to grab it. But she revealed with frustration that it wasn't quite as small as she had once been. She couldn't fit the narrow opening, and managed to even get stuck. Wriggling around, she let out a quiet hiss, her limbs flailing, trying to pry the body with one way or another. It was no use. She'd have to ask for his help to get out of there, and he better damn get her out, because the water would be helpful to everyone, including him. "Troy!" she yelled, grunting with effort and turning her head into his general direction. "Troy, I need help." "What? Jesus, kid, can't you do anything, can you?" His voice response was muffled, but he could detect his own deterioration plainly in the words. I can do more than you," she muttered, mostly to herself. She may just have to ask why she saved his life, but he still didn't seem grateful. Raising her voice, she quickly added, "Hurry!" Ignoring his annoyed grumbles, she glanced around the back of the office, waiting for him. Everything seemed untouched. Despite the state of the rest of the museum, the water tub was most likely a refill for a cooler or something like that. Though it didn't really matter what it had been used for, because it would have been good to put to good use now. Clementine's mouth felt dry just staring at it, and she hadn't had a drink for at least half a day now. It just looked like heaven in a bottle. In fact, a closer look revealed that another bottle was right behind it, fresh for the picking. She almost wept in relief. The pull on her legs interrupted her bliss. Familiar grunts from outside the office cue on her Troy's rough efforts to yank her out. He was being careless, and she wasn't so sure if it was just because he got injured. "Be careful!" she yelled. The pole started to hurt. I'm trying," he yelled back, although seriously doubted while he was trying to be gentle. "You try doing this with one arm, you see how easy it is." After a few more yanks, she heard him yelp in pain as she was let go. "Troy!" she called, her mind racing. Every second she was just stuck there for another second, as she could be put into danger. And Troy was not helping. She needed to get out immediately, before any walkers appeared. God, what if he ran off and left her to die? It would be just like him too. After she told him why she saved him, that she believed in the world doesn't need to work for Carver intended, with the weak being thrown away, but Troy was part of Carver's community, and put in the authority position no less. So, of course, he had to disagree. The survival of the fittest lessons were probably ground into his mind, that mad man. She couldn't even have tried to claw in like this, but maybe she should have just attempted to get to the room another way. She would have fought through that. She realized that was not only his limits, but her own. She couldn't stay small forever, after all. Lee had told her that she was smarter than the walkers, but she wasn't so sure anymore. It was too late now anyway, to regret. She then struggled harder, her yells to Troy becoming pleas. "Troy, get me out!" Her screams were gaining in volume out, but before she could realize how much danger she was putting herself in, the familiar snarls sounded nearby. Oh no! A sinking feeling pulled into her stomach. Her heart beating was whipped up as her head back forth in fear, trying to find out where the noise was coming from. It was obvious what it was, but where was it? A rocker crawled out from under the desk in the office. His hands already reached forward as it clawed its way through the door. It was chained to the radiator near the water coolers, a cuff glistening around its gnarled wrist. Clementine knew that she wasn't safe, although the metal of the handcuffs was rusted enough, and the creature's wrist was rotting off, both chipping away at each pull. She swallowed hard while bugging wide as she writhed to get herself unstuck. Troy, there's a walker in there!" she shrieked. Watching it grumble and claw for her, flashbacks of Lee being chained in a similar fashion threatened to floor her mind, but she wouldn't let them. Survival was the most important thing now. "Help!" Panic started to crawl through her as the walker's wrist snapped off with a loud crack. It stumbled forward, lifeless eyes fixated at her hungrily. She had seen that look before. The look of a hunter found a prey, stuck there just convenient for a meal. No, she'd come too far to die here. Time had slowed down and there was a loud bang, the sound of wood snapping off the metal hinges as the office door was forced open. The walker's face was a few feet away from her, raw teeth already gnawing at their preparation for her flesh. Blurs of the green and red flashed before her. The creature then sunk to the ground. Her heartbeat thumped loudly in her ears and her hands trembling as she pushed herself up on the surface on the other side of the office below her, peering over the edge to get a better look. The walker had sprawled out onto the floor, its jaw unhinged hungrily, and macabre arms outstretched towards her. It was still as stone, rotting and blood-gushing, glistening opening through its head assembled into a black tomato split open. Was it really over? Clementine then pushed the internal shock away, and her head lifting to see Troy standing over her with the meat cleaver in hand, now both decorated with the putrid guts of the dead walker. She hadn't realized that tears had pricked her eyes. Wiping them away quickly, she stared up at the man, trying to slow her racing heart. Thanks, she murmured, suddenly feeling out of breath. He didn't answer. He merely just used a hand to lift the office shade, pulling it up far enough so she could wriggle forward and fall to the ground. As soon as she hit the floor, she let out a quiet oof, and just sat there for a few minutes to calm herself down. She wondered what had taken them so long to get help, but the answer was clear that she looked around the office. The door had been struck until it snapped off its hinges, probably needing more than a few kicks to kick it open. Contrary to her fears, he didn't abandon her, whatever it was his own choice or just a twisted way to keep her around to protect him. She didn't know, nor she wanted to. You didn't get bit, did ya? Troy asked, settling down with his brown eyes focused on her. Immediately she shook her head, showing her arms to prove that the walker had not touched her before she intervened. No, I'm okay, she assured. But why did you help me? He quirked an eyebrow, lips pierced in puzzlement. Well, there was water here. Like you said, we needed that shit myself, if you end up dying anyway. After he flashed him a glare, she said, Besides, I guess I didn't want to deal with the world's smallest lurker. It would just been a pathetic to see. He just had to insult her, didn't he? He couldn't say one nice thing. She crossed his arms and pierced her lips. But you could have just hit me in the head too if I turned. You wouldn't have to help me, she pointed out bitterly. Scoffing, the man replied, What do you mean you want my help? You could have fooled me, and the way you were screaming for me was like being eaten alive. Her eyes narrowed. Of course she wanted his help in that situation. But the truth is that she didn't want to think that he'd do anything. In fact, she was almost expecting him to run away. Maybe he was smarter than he appeared. Come on, he continued. We got our asses in here, so now we gotta take the water and leave. It ain't safe here. He scanned for the small room as if more walkers would spring out and around the dead at their feet. Clementine nodded. She knew they had to move. The problem, however, lied in size in the matter of waters. She doubted it'd be easy for either of them to carry. They could always wait for the others to come back, but the possibility of bandits nearby worried her. Maybe she was paranoid, but she had thieves destroyed her group before, and she didn't want that to happen again. Before she could give her voice and concerns, Troy clutched one of the bottles, lifting it with a grunt on his shoulder. Grab the other one, he muttered, his teeth gnashed together. His expression was distorted, obvious to the pain, and the girl noticed that as the severed limb was bleeding faster now. They had to get a secluded area quick, and then she could deal with them. Although a sudden thought struck her. The coat, 1 second, she said. Hurried back to the exhibit's remains and placed both the Confederate coat and her cleaver into her backpack. Returning to him as quickly as he could, he merely glared at her, still struggling but said nothing. Facing the remaining bottle, she took a deep breath. This would take a lot of strength. She was probably weak physically, and a part of her still felt like shaking up from the nearby bush death. Clementine, come on, hurry! Troy was probably meant to sound like he was barking orders like back at Howe's, but his words merely sounded pained and desperate. Without answering, she crouched down, placed both her hands on the bottom of the cooler. With a groan of effort, she lifted off the ground, back hunching over as she turned to face Troy. It's almost as big as you, he commented humorously, turning around and beginning to walk out of the office. He stumbled a bit, nearly losing his footing a few times as they left the museum. They both agreed that they would have to come back if they had a group to dig around deeper for supplies, and the water was the most important thing right now anyway. Clementine felt the water weighing her down, and she nearly fell a couple of times, her fingers trying desperately to keep a firm grasp on the slippery surface. Both of them kept a slow but fixed pace. Keeping their gazes focused ahead, they tried to forget their current struggles, Troy's pain and Clementine's depleting strength. After traveling down the marked path a little more, the clearing for Parker's Run appeared before them. The giant map of the tourist attraction marked the area, as well as a giant statue of a soldier carrying another. Clementine then noticed a tent sent up nearby and almost let out a long sigh of relief. "Look over there," she indicated, nodding her head towards their discovery. "Thank Christ," Troy replied, his voice sounding far away. Carelessly, he threw the water onto the ground, his legs buckling and his knees hitting the dirt roughly. Clementine then placed the water container next to his and approached him cautiously, watching as he hunched over himself, his hand planted firmly on the ground for support. "Do you think you can crawl to the tent?" she asked, swinging her backpack off to her in her arms. He just scoffed and just muttered of course he could, and scrambled forward on his hands and knees to the tent. They were lucky it was empty, not the best place to be, but still good enough spot to wait for the others anyway. She seated herself a bit ways from the entrance, just in case if the walkers get an idea to pop in. The coast seemed relatively clear though. Her companion seated himself across from her, once more looking pale and weak. He most likely would have pushed himself too far, exhausting his injured body. She wasn't an expert on this, though, and it would have been much more better if everyone else in the situation in general, and if Carlos was alive, though, too. Clementine didn't want to think of him as just useful doctor. Sarah mourned for his lost life, and so she felt the rest of the group should, too. They were like a family now, after all. Sadly, there was never a proper time to grieve over lost friends and family. Sighing, Clementine decided to think about it later. It trained her eyes over her companion and watching him lean back against the material as he closed his eyes, and for a few moments, quiet gasp escaping from his lips. "Are you going to be okay?" she whispered, holding her breath just in case he wouldn't respond and the worst that happened. Thankfully, though, he opened his eyes and "Yeah, I'm fine. It just fucking hurts." He clenched his teeth and let out a pained hiss, adjusting the sitting position and made her gaze better. "But at least you're alive," she pointed out, not even bothering to admit that she was so alive now because of him. She was just grateful, and of course, but she still had her pride. Plus, it was Troy that she still didn't like him. He nodded again, breathing in a deep sigh. No shit. He examined the stump arm. His heavy breaths only sounded that of a quiet tent. Clementine couldn't even begin to wonder what he was thinking. But if it was her, she'd be growing a bit concerned now on how he was going to live with only 3 out of the 4 limbs she'd been born with. After unzipping the backpack and taking out the bandages and things she grabbed from the drugstore, she also grabbed the cleaver and kept it near her, just in case of an emergency. Her eyes carefully tracked the man's pained face and injury, then back to her tools. She was no expert on first aid, but she would have to try. It was getting critical. She hesitated, unsure of where to start. What did she need for her arm? The cabin at the shed scenario seemed like it had been happened forever ago, but it only had been a few days in reality. She snuck into the cabin for antiseptic, bandages, and sewing needle. So she had to clean the bandage and stitch. Oh God, if only she had to stitch his severed limb shut. No, she decided against it. It really wasn't sure if she would stitch a huge gash wound shut properly. It might end up doing more damage than aid anyway. She had cleaned it up and applied the bandages, as well as applied a new tourniquet. It was more than enough right now, and he would be thankful he was getting that much. Well, at first, it would help that if she got it to be in the big camouflage obstruction out of the way. "Troy, can you take off your jacket?" she asked, crawling forward towards him with a few rolls of bandages, with a quarter of a empty half bottle of antiseptic. She absolutely did not want to do this, but she had to remind herself what Lee would have. Lee would have been happy for her to do this. He'd be proud that she was doing this, though, thing for someone so difficult and unpleasant. Troy flashed her a glare, but shook his head. I don't think I can, he replied, and she believed him. Piercing her lips, she decided that they had to remove the jacket. Holding onto his sleeve and pulled it with his good arm was the first release first. He hissed in pain and jerking the movements, shying away from the touch, but she pierced further. We have no choice, she murmured, a bit frustrated in his efforts to rebel against her. Eventually, she got him to warn out of his way of the jacket, and by his head, he had carefully pulled it over his stumped arm, without any few grunts or whines of pain, of course. Good thing he didn't lash out. Probably he knew she'd stop helping if he did. His gray t-shirt lay underneath was soaked from blood from his right shoulder, but at least he would wound to could breathe a little better. Now all she had to do was remove the rope and continue to work on the chopped area itself. She pointed the tourniquet, keeping the blood flowing to a minimum, ordering him to remove it because she was sure was hell wasn't going to do it herself. Are you kidding me? He asked, frowning. That'll just make it worse, you dumbass. Remove it and I'll start bleeding all over. Don't you know what you're doing? I do. Take the rope off, she pierced, her eyes narrowing. Over my dead body. The idiot obviously didn't know how it was possible to statement of could be if his wound left untouched. But it was Clementine's responsibility. All she had to do was take care of Troy. Sure, she wanted to help doing the right thing, but the man didn't even want her help. What do you think we should do then? Tell me your plan, she snapped, getting irritated with his stubborn behavior, and he wasn't acting much like an adult. Glancing out at the wound and then back at the items in hand, Troy replied, What are you going to do ought to work? Spray and bandage? Christ, I should have known better than to trust a kid to help me out. You obviously don't know the first thing you're taking care of wounds. Clementine's teeth clenched and her eyes narrowed at the slits. She obviously could feel herself getting frustrated with him. He didn't even know what he was talking about, for one, and didn't even think she was capable of doing anything, did he? We can't do anything without removing the rope, Troy, she insisted. Hesitation flashed in his eyes in a moment before he broke her gaze, frustrated and passing through his lips. Keep it on. They ain't doing anything wrong. If the rope rubs into the wound, it will hurt a lot more, Clementine hissed slowly, and it's in the way. I'll clean up the rope and wrap it back around until we find another one or a belt or something. Troy's nostrils flared as he scooted back towards her from the bit, clearly uncomfortable. Well, maybe I don't trust a little shit to fuck up and get me killed when his arm's gushing blood. Can you blame me? Realization dawned on her. He was so scared, and it made more sense. Really, she knew that she wasn't really the biggest crayon in the box, but she didn't think that he'd refused help profusely. In truth, he was afraid that she'd messed up and get him killed. Well, it didn't change the fact that he was being a baby about the whole thing and would have to prove it to him. She sat back on her legs and, kneeling in position, unzipping the jacket and pulling off with a quiet grunt of effort. What are you doing? She merely raised her arm, showing him the bandages still wrapped up in her wound. You see this? She asked. Yeah. He quirked an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. Deciding that she needed to change her own bandages anyway, she peeled the sticky fabric, noticing the sloppy stitching still in place. Carlos had said that she'd done a good enough job of sewing it up, and more or less cleaned it better and bandaged it when he took care of her. She had been relieved that her pain of the invader hadn't been all for nothing. What the hell, did you get bit? The one-armed man engaged himself away from her further, his back pressed against the tense wall. Rolling her eyes, she replied, No, well, a dog bit me, actually, a few days ago, when I met up with Luke's group. They didn't believe me, so they locked in the shed all night by myself. More a lot than Bill would have done, Troy muttered. He probably just cut your arm off and left you in the yard all night to see if you turned anyway. Thoughtfully, she asked, What was that he did with Reggie? Bingo, Troy replied with a nod. With a roll in her eyes, she probably shoved her arm in the gaze and pointed to the stitches. You see these? He moved his head away from her, averting his gaze. God, you get your gross arm out of my face, Clementine. Come on, I don't want to see that shit. She didn't move. Too bad. Do you see the stitches? Yeah, I see them. What about them? Pulling back once as she got a new look, she snapped. I had to sew this up by myself, with nothing but a sip of apple juice for comfort. I dug into the needle into my open wound all by myself in the shed. She traced her finger slightly across the stitches. They reminded her of the black spiders crawling around in her arm. After gazing at them thoughtfully, she glared back at Troy. If I can do that, then you can get yourself over with that and get that rope off so I can clean your wound. You need to quit being a baby and let me help you or you die. And whatever she liked him or not, Clementine didn't really want Troy to die. Yes, she had seen enough death, yes, but she couldn't get used to it being constantly around her. She wouldn't become numb to it, and in fact, death was a tragic thing. Even if it was just the cannibals who killed Mark, or the stranger who kidnapped her, even if it was Troy or even Carver. The man's face hardened. His lips pierced through the eyes shut, and for a moment, Clementine thought he'd refuse again. But finally he nodded, murmuring something that she didn't catch under his breath, and returned to his original position. Proud of herself, Clementine sat near his severed limb, waiting for him to remove the rope so she could remove the jacket and stop the blood flow. The man's breathing grew heavily, and his eyes focused on the limb, fingers trembling inches away from the rope. Troy, come on, she urged, losing patience. All right, just hold on. He hesitated, his eyes screwing shut as he took a long, deep breath and pulled the rope off. Immediately he howled in agony, horrified at the blood gushing like a river. From the reminder of his arm whimpering, he yelled, It hurts! It hurts! Stop it! Stop the blood! So much freaking blood! She quickly removed the pressing jacket against the amputated area tightly, making sure to apply as much pressure as she could. She grabbed the antiseptic and readied it. She then fought this sudden urge to hush him, but of course the urge was born right out and needed to keep him out of danger, then his serious concern. But any thought of comforting Troy felt strange. She was about to let him alert all the walkers within 10 miles of their location, so she upped to his hiss. Calm down. I know it hurts, but you need to be quiet so we won't attract the walkers. The words connected with him, miraculously. He quieted down as best he could, and his eyes still squeezed shut. It's going to hurt worse for a bit, she warned, giving him the time to react before she moved the jacket and sprayed down the wound as much antiseptic as she could on there. With a horrible hissing sound, the wound bubbled and white, showing that the area was being cleaned by the medicine. Troy's eyelids fluttered weakly. His eyes gazed over in pain as he seemed to be losing his grip and consciousness. His teeth sunk down at the back of one of his fingers, tiny streaks of blood falling down of how hard he was biting. Grabbing his hand and prying out of his teeth, she placed the jacket in his palm, instructing him to keep it in place on the injured area while she prepared the bandages. With the shaking and bloody fingers, he managed to keep the fabric in place. She then turned back to her supplies, unrolling a few bandages. No one would be wasted, so she could just take it out at the right amount to wrap it around Troy's limbs a few times. She glanced at the man, watching him grasp in pain and try not to get into shock, before placing one of his bandages ends onto the area. You can let go, she told him, and he obeyed. Immediately she began to wrap the wound, noticing a flinch that he made as he did so. Once, twice, thrice, and at the 5th or 6th wrap round, she ran out of the bandage and tied a few tight knots to secure it. Breathing in sigh of relief, she sank back to her knees. It's wrapped. His head hung low again, looking positively drained from that, but he wasn't complaining. He raised his gaze slightly, his eyes looking through her. There was this one's gonna kinda sick irony, he groaned, humorously sickening. What do you mean? She asked, working on disinfecting the rope as they spoke. After Mike cut off Reggie's arm, I was supposed to keep an eye on him in the pen, he explained, leaning back and lifting his head to stare at the ceiling of the tent. You know what I said. I ain't coddling with the asshole and left him to fend for himself. I didn't even care. It was probably like this or worse. Clementine raised her eyebrows thoughtfully, studying, saying nothing yet. Perhaps it was just some odd justice in her decision to lob Troy's arm off. As she sprayed the rope up and down it with antiseptic, making sure that it didn't touch the ground, as the last thing she wanted was dirt to get in it. She commented, Reggie was so sure that he was going to be back inside if he behaved. Was that true? She couldn't see Carver being that forgiving of a man. Not surprisingly, Troy shook his head and let out another dry laugh. Nah, he muttered. Bill wasn't gonna let him in. Reggie was weak, not because of his arm, but I just think he just didn't have what it took. And what did it take? Clementine asked, raising an eyebrow. Hitting children? Shooting anyone on sight? Asking how high when Carver told you to jump? If so, Troy had took it completely. Not that it was a good thing. No, just a conviction, mental strength, the ability to make sacrifices. Reggie was a sacrifice, Clementine shot back, still better at the whole thing, because Carver thought of him as an object instead of a person. But Carver's way of thinking was wrong. Troy narrowed his eyes. Watch your mouth, girlie, he snarled. Till you assholes decide to get up and run, things are going just fine. For you. 'Cause I earned my place. And look where you are now. With a quiet sigh, Clementine prepared the rope and bandaged his stump. This wasn't the best idea, but she had no other means of deterrent. Biting back with his plan, Troy just growled, Look, I'm not saying it was perfect, but Bill had a good idea in mind. The strong survived, killing weak Link would have saved us. Clementine's gaze darkened, light brown eyes glistering with anger. Do you know how Carver died? Huh? She didn't even get him a chance to reply. Tying the rope on his wound, Kenny beat him to death with a crowbar after shooting both of his knees. I watched him and Carver died alone, looking at the people who absolutely despised him. Troy's expression softened. What does that have to do? If you continue to be like him, that kind of thing is going to happen to you. And she didn't really care. Her voice then grew colder as she finished up the rope's knots, standing up and looking down at him. In a way, it was a good indicator of who she was more dominant than in this situation. Who called the one-shots? Clementine wouldn't help but put up any bossiness any longer. You'll die alone, she warned, with everyone else she left behind being happy that what she did. She could see the realization dawn on his face, some surprise and an unknown emotions mixed in. Before either of them could say a word, a voice called from outside. Hey, Clementine, you out there? Poking her head out of the tent, she found Rebecca and Sarita outside. They both seemed okay, though, simply out of breath. Clementine noticed instantly a distinct lack of someone that she had left with them. What's wrong? She asked, the familiar, sinking feeling pulling into her stomach. Sarita bit her lip, and her eyes were unreadable. I'm worried about Sarah.